afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending from where you are joining the session today. Welcome to today's webinar. I am Richa, Education Support Manager at ACCA. Our session today is designed to support you with audit and assurance paper, where expert tutor will share his insights to help you with the preparation of exam. This webinar will be covering December 23 examiners report using technical examples and some quick tips which will further help you during your exam practice. You will also have an opportunity to ask your questions live. Expert will be providing answers to most asked questions from the student, and I'm very pleased to be joined by expert tutor Roger Kitonga. Before I hand over to Roger, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items very quickly. At the bottom of your screen, you will be seeing a number of buttons. There is a help icon, which will provide you the resources and information to help you resolve any technical issues you might experience. There are icons for the slides and media player. You need to see both of them during the webinar so that you should make sure that you have selected them. There is an attendee chat function also, through which you can engage with fellow webinar attendees, and its icon looks, it should be there on your screen. Then there is a resource list. That is the icon with the file symbol. If you click on this, you will be able to access resources which are relevant to today's webinar, including the direct links. You can rearrange your screen to suit you and resize the windows if you need to. And if at any point you cannot hear what we are saying or you are not able to see any visuals, we would request you to please refresh your browser. Registering for this webinar means you will be sent an email tomorrow with details of how you can listen to it again. So don't worry if you miss something or you have any technical issues, you will definitely be able to access the recording. So I'm going to hand over to Roger in a moment. In the meantime, during the session, if you want to ask ACCA or Roger a question, then please click on Q&A button, and that is available on your screen. Please note, we cannot guarantee responding to everyone directly, either verbally or via web chat, but we really hope that the questions which we are sharing towards the end will be helpful to everyone. So with this, now I am handing over to Roger. Over to you, please.
All right, thank you so much, Richard. Love to welcome each and every one of you into this particular InFocus webinar. I must state first and foremost, before I introduce myself, that audit and assurance is an easy paper. Now, I know this is a very debatable conversation, and I know this statement that I've actually made might throw us off a bit. But in reality, I must tell you for a fact that this paper is actually an easy one. And therefore, as we debunk, the examiner's report, and as we get the chance to actually touch on a few questions and maybe just a few additional tips from me, then it might give you an appreciation that this paper may not be as hard as we're thinking. So let us delve into it and maybe just get to understand. As you can see, they have a fantastic smile when I try. But I will say first and foremost, I'm an ACCA member, a seasoned tutor. I've taught for over a decade as a tutor. I've also worked in the finance department or the finance industry, and also as an accountant. I also do some consultants on the side. I'm a graduate of the Oxford Brookes program, an MBA holder from Plymouth Majon University, both in the UK. I've also excelled as a senior accountant and auditor, and therefore I must tell you that the things that we learn in audit are very practical. I've also contributed especially to SMEs and NGOs in my consultancy work. I'm a recipient of the ACC Advocacy Award. This is normally an award given to members in different countries. I'm also a distinguished lecturer, having been voted as the best lecturer in my country and also the best tax lecturer some time back. I've produced toppers in both the audit and the tax paper, and I do hope that this session will produce a topper as well based on the tips that we're going to be picking up from there. I'm a lover of life, a lover of people, and also a lover of safaris and hiking. As you can see, I'm from Kenya, and therefore we have quite a bit. I think we're the only city in the world that has a national park. You can imagine, most people think they'll find lions on the streets, but that's not the case. Now, I'd love to start off with what we are going to be dealing with today. First and foremost, we will be having our examiner's report, just trying to really understand what the examiner wants to tell us about this paper, what the examiner wants us to understand, especially concerning December 2023. And then I want us to avoid common mistakes, and then we will have a live Q&A session. All right? Now, just let's start off from this. So how do I really pass this paper? This is the first question that normally rings in so many students' minds. I mean, we looked at the pass rates, and you see here that the pass rates have been ranging between 40 to 44%. And this might sometimes discourage you into thinking, I might not necessarily pass this paper, but come on, we can uplift this pass mark. So how do we pass this paper? The very first thing that I want us to consider is that the examiner says that to pass this exam, candidates should ensure they devote adequate time and obtain the required level of knowledge and application. Now, I know this sounds so easy. Don't you might be like, okay, fine, knowledge and application. How does that necessarily work? So what that means really is that first and foremost, candidates who do not spend time in practicing questions might really struggle in the application aspect. So what I like with my students to do is to take some time first to attain knowledge, 50% of their time, as they're doing questions. And then in the revision phase, they focus primarily on practicing. So 50% really on developing their content, but 50% on practicing revision questions and also doing the mock in the test or in the practice platform. So this is one of the few things that the examiner really encourage people to do. Practice questions. It might seem like it might not necessarily work, but for me, when I did ACCA more than a decade ago, I must tell you for a fact that this really helped me. I must appreciate the fact that consistently, let me give you a tip here. And I know this is going ahead, but practicing usually comes in two aspects. The first aspect is the quantity, and the second aspect is the quality. So let me just give a good idea of this. With the quantity, you really want to spend so much time in doing multiple questions. Why so? Quantity gives you the opportunity to understand how the examiner could test a certain concept multiple times. So you might have a question on audit risk, and you realize that as you did multiple questions on audit risk, you'd notice a repetition of certain key risks that are consistently repeated, and even their appropriate audit response. So doing multiple questions in terms of quantity gives you that. But then on the second hand, quality. What does quality mean? Quality basically means, do you understand the answer you're giving? Sometimes I know students get the temptation of looking through a question and then just referring to the answers without really taking the time to understand why was this answer given. Most of the times the answers given in either the revision kits or the study hub answers could be the most perfect answers. So the question is not to really replicate those answers per se, word for word, but to really understand what was the train of thought in this answer. Why does my answer look so different from this particular answer? Do I achieve or satisfy the same objective as the answer I see? So when you're practicing questions, spend so much time on those two aspects. Now, I want us to go into this aspect here of knowledge-based questions. Now, with the knowledge-based questions you're told here, and I know this is a problem for many students, I won't lie to you, I have seen most students really when the question starts with ISA 250, ISA 325, ISA this, ISA that, guys are like, oh my God, what do I do here? Define the factors that affect materiality. And you've not necessarily grasped these knowledge-based questions. Please, knowledge gives you power. When I used to study, I never used to study just to pass, though a very important thing, but I wanted to also just know. The importance was, do I really know my stuff? If I was questioned out there, would I really give an appropriate answer? Would I necessarily ace an interview if I was asked about an ASA? So my privilege is not just to focus on passing the paper, but to also understand that we want to develop competent students so that we can have competent members. Now, we realize here that knowledge requirements, as the examiner says, can sometimes have an opening statement referring to an ISA. And this normally just helps the student understand the scene that has been set, and it also provides clarification on what the question is requiring from you. All right, so that's one of the few things I want us to be very keen on. Now, the next thing we see here, also when reviewing knowledge requirements, the examiner states it's very important to identify whether an understanding of the scenario is required to attempt the question. Whoops. Now, this usually throws me off sometimes because I've seen so many students normally really getting so excited to just answer the question, the knowledge-based questions, without really referring to the scenario. So what happens is that you just say, okay, they've told us to define audit risk and give the components of the audit risk. So we just quickly jot down the answer. We don't necessarily look at whether there is some attachment to the scenario. And sometimes that could cost us a bit. I saw in one question where they were asking about fraud, but they wanted us to specifically give the two types of fraud, which was misrepresentation and misappropriation. And when they asked, once you give your two types of fraud, you were to link those two types to the scenario. So if you only answered it as a knowledge-based question without linking it to the scenario, then you'd lose out on marks. So many times, you have to look out for that. Look out for whether the question requires you to refer to the scenario. Now, you're told here where the knowledge requirement is not linked to the scenario, a note is included confirming this. It is especially important that candidates understand exactly what the question is asking and whether they need to apply their knowledge to that scenario. Very important. Now, please take your time. Read the underlying keywords. I'll give you an example. I gave a question to my students this week, and this question required them to, to identify the deficiencies, give a recommendation, and a test of control. And one of the things that was in the requirement was they were getting an extra 2 marks for writing a covering letter, and they completely missed it out. Such a large class, and no one identified that the question required them to write a cover letter. So they missed out on an extra free 2 marks. I call it free 2 marks because a cover letter is not really a hard letter to write. Now, if you want more information on how to write that cover letter, I would refer you to the Study Hub chapter 13. It will really give you the components of what you should include in that cover letter. So they really struggle with that. Can you imagine? So read the requirements. Requirements guide you on what it expects. What do we expect from you? Now, one of the questions that was asked in December was to describe 8 audit risks. Look at the word there. Describe. Describe. Most students state, most students explain. Actually just state. They only identify, but they don't describe. When I tell you describe, what I mean is, if I tell you describe Roger, you will tell me he wears glasses, he has a red tie, he has an ACCA badge, and he has long hair, maybe, right? You describe it so that if anyone walks into any room that I'm in, they can easily identify that's Roger, right? Describe. So why is it an audit risk? 2, describe audit risks, not business risks, and then give an appropriate response. So what did students do in this question? Let's look. So marks were awarded for identifying your risk, that's half a mark. Explaining the risk, which is another half a mark. So many students know how to identify the risks. That's something that I have seen. But many of them don't know how to explain the risks, and we're going to look at that. And then the examiner stated that an appropriate response would ideally attract 1 mark. Now, the scenario will typically contain more than the number of risks. And this is quite interesting because the question stated, describe 8 audit risks. That basically means there could be up to 10, 11 audit risks in that scenario. And as a result of that, when you read through the scenario, and as you particularly identify the risks, choose your best 8. We will mark your first 8, so choose your best 8. Don't get to the plan where you just copy paste, and you've not really thought through how you will answer that particular risk that you've identified. Choose your best 8 out of the possible 10 that you might have identified, okay? Don't necessarily just delve. So you're told here, the first step is really to identify what will give rise to a risk. How do we do this? So, sorry, let me go back. Just skipped something there. Move. Sorry for that. I want you just to really understand, what do we really look for when we're identifying our risks? When we're identifying our risks. So let's look at this. So when you're undertaking this with the highlight function, and I'm very clear to ensure I keep on choosing it in different colors so that I can separate the risks. So one will be in yellow, another will be in green, another one will be in pink. You know, you have about 4 colors to choose from. Another will be in blue. And it just gives me the chance to really pick up my very strong 8 points. All right, so use the highlight function. Now, the challenge I have with identifying risks is many times candidates use the copy-paste function, and that's good. That's good. Copy pasting really saves you time. You know, you don't have to type in your answers. It really cuts a lot on your time, right? It really saves you time. But I must tell you, there's an issue with this, because you have to be very careful. When you copy paste, be very careful. I usually jokingly tell my students, you know, copy paste with wisdom. All right? Try and see whether whatever you've copy pasted actually has the risk that you're trying to identify. Sometimes I've just seen students copy pasting, but there's no risk in their copy pasted sentence. So see whether whatever you've copy pasted is actually the risk. Some people just copy paste the scenario. There's really no risk identified there. You will get marks. So be very careful with that. For example, let's look at an example here. Stating that the company's credit controller was ill and absent from work for 4 months is not really a risk. Now, I know some of us are overthinkers, so you're like, oh my God, maybe, you know, this person is not there, so, you know, they've not been able to collect their debt and stuff. And that's not really a problem, all right? It's possible that when this person was ill, just like in normal businesses, things still operate. So if you're not well, someone could come and step in for this person, okay? So the thing is here, in itself is not a risk, all right? But you appreciate the fact, however, that the scenario then went on to state that the receivables collection period has increased from 45 to 75 days. Now you see, if you put both facts together, then that's identifying. Now we can see why it's a problem, all right? Okay, stating one without the other, the examiner said, will not gain credit. So there are times when someone would say, the company's credit controller was ill and absent from work for months. All right, so what happened? Why was that a problem? It should be in the scenario, you know. So we say here the receivables collection period as a result of that increased sense. So don't, or even though you just want to say receivables collection period has increased from 45 to 75 days, that doesn't really help us. You want to state what caused that. And what caused that is probably the credit controller was ill, absent from work. Now, that is a sufficient answer. That is a sufficient answer. Now, please note, I know some of you probably crammed through FA or financial accounting, you know, but financial accounting is very important in audit risks. It really tests your understanding on the double entry system. I must tell you, the accounting treatments, very, very important. Now, what about explaining the risk? Oh my. Now, I know this is usually a problem for some people. I've identified the risk. I understand you, Roger. It makes sense. Now, how do I explain my risk? Let's look at this. Now, I usually look at it in 3 ways, but let's pick up on a few things that the examiner stated. Having identified the risk factor, of course, the next part is to explain it. So the specific area of the financial statements impacted with an assertion. So I could say previously, based on the example we've given, that receivables, that's the area affected, could be overvalued. That's the assertion, right? Or overstated. So I could also explain it in that way, right? Now, There's also a reference to the components of the risk. You could talk about inherent, control, detection. But I must tell you, I'm not really a big fan of that because I found a lot of students struggling to really know which component is affected. So this is just my personal advice. There is a time when if you want to really explain your risk, state the area affected. Is it the non-current assets? Be specific, all right? Is it property, plant, and equipment? Is it inventory? Just stating current assets is not enough. Is it inventory? And then tell us, how has it been affected? Is it the cutoff that is an issue, that they've been recorded in the wrong account? There's a risk that they could have been recorded in the wrong accounting period. What's the actual issue? And then with misstated, sometimes you have to be very careful. If we find that the scenario could be probably receivables is overstated and you say receivables is misstated, we'll know you're gambling. You're gambling. And therefore, we won't award you a mark for that, all right? So be very careful with that. Let's give an example here. So you told here, in respect of the issue relating to the change in useful lives, which was a question tested in the previous December 2023, only noting non-current assets or assets could be overstated would not be awarded a credit. Can you imagine? An appropriate explanation in this instance could be property, plant, and equipment. You see, we are more specific because non-current assets is wide. Assets is wide. But when you specify PPE, could be overstated now, that will give you a mark. Now we know you've chosen the specific area, all right? Now, what about the response? Responses must be practical, okay? I know a lot of students really struggle with this part. They end up giving what management should do. Let me state this. The auditor's response is still a procedure. What is a procedure? A procedure is a process. You know, if I tell you, how did you guys log in into this webinar? You will describe the process. Maybe you opened up your email. You clicked on the link. It asked you a few questions before. You accepted the conditions. You entered. You're giving me the process. Okay? Process normally answers the question how. So when I ask you, how can you confirm if the risk is there or not? You describe the response, the how. So some candidates give general statements. For example, for the inventory risk, it was common to see complete NRV testing rather than how the auditor would test whether the recent cost of inventory is above or below NRV. So if you just say, perform a detailed net realizable value testing, how? How do we do this? Remember, you're describing a process. So I could come there and say, you know, obtain probably, let's say, the purchase invoice to determine the cost and the sales invoice to determine the NRV for a sample of items or inventory items within the list to confirm if they've been recorded at the lower of cost and net realizable value. Now that makes sense. That makes sense. You've described the how. And I'm thinking maybe some of us might have struggled with that how, right? Please note, you don't have to give a detailed procedure, but it's still an approach the audit team will take, all right, as a result of this. Now, candidates often like to give this answer. This is a detailed, it's a Rutland answer, you know, increase professional skepticism. My goodness. Now, that's not alone, it's not enough. Can you imagine if I tell you, when I entered this room, I should be professional, skeptic. I need to be professional. My professional behavior needs to be high. Can you imagine for 1 hour that I'm with you? Then you give me my response and you tell Roger should he should professionally behave himself. And I'm like, okay, and then what? Should he just keep quiet now for a whole hour? No, describe that. Give more. So stating only professional skepticism, especially with fraud. Because I know most of the times if the risk is that fraud, you know, there could be fraudulent expenses, or maybe especially with bonuses, you know, there's an incentive to overstate your profits. The first answer you'd like to give is increase professional skepticism. Well, yes, but that's not enough. What should we do to test the sales or the profit to confirm that the profit is not overstated? What should we do? Another response that people like is discuss with management. All right. What am I going to discuss with them? We could discuss about our lunch. We could discuss about the best places to go, you know. So you need to really state, what are we going to discuss with them? All right. What are we going to ask them about? Just discussing enough is not enough. Be very careful with that. Then substantive procedures. Ooh, I know some of you got chills here. Yeah, the term substantive procedures throws a cold chill through down people's spines. So let me try and simplify it. 1 mark, and whenever you find here that, let's say for instance, you've been told 5 marks, describe substantive procedures around receivables. 5 marks. We know we are asking you to give 5 points, so you really need to plan your time accordingly for that. Okay. Now, when describing substantive procedures, one of the things you want to consider is the level of detail. The term substantive, substance, means you need to give much. You need to give detail. I'm not saying write a composition, not write a biography, but write a process that makes sense. I love to normally tell my students, I want you to imagine if you are the audit manager and you are ideally instructing the audit intern and you had the patience to do so, what process would you write down for them to follow? What, like, if they were to actually follow, they would actually find themselves catering or describing everything. Can you imagine if I told you, how should I normally place an order in a McDonald's restaurant? And you describe for me the process. And I'll tell you, I will take your paper and I will follow every step you mentioned here. Everything you've written in this sentence, I will follow. And the end result is that I should be able to get what I wanted. So you have to give at least a detailed process. Okay, which source document are you obtaining? What should it be used for? Things like that. Mention that aspect. Candidates must ensure, my goodness, distinguish between a substantive procedure and a test of control. Now, I hope this is not your first time you're hearing my voice, but if it is, I do recommend you to go to the YouTube, the ACCA Student Resources YouTube page. I do a video on test of controls, and in that video, I really take the time to distinguish between the test of control and the substantive procedures. I think it's a wonderful video. I know this is self-review, as you might ideally identify, but I do think it's a wonderful video, so go check it out. It would really help you to distinguish between the two, all right? Now, analytical procedures, these are usually my students' favorite. You know why? They're easy to give, and they're very useful in auditing revenue. They can be used to generate several valid tests. But why people like it is because you're able to obtain an appropriate ratio. So if it's, let's say, for profit, I'll use the gross profit margin. If it is for revenue, gross profit margin, operating profit, margin, net profit margin, you'll have appropriate ratios to use. If it's receivables, the receivables collection period. So you're able to obtain the receivables collection period of the current year, compare it with the prior year, and it should go on to say, in all cases, any significant fluctuations must be investigated, not just identified. So normally the analytical procedures would end with, and if there's any significant differences, investigate them. If there's any significant differences, discuss with management and do a more substantive procedures or sufficient substantive procedures. So if you don't review those fluctuations, only half a mark will be awarded. Now, when generating substantive procedures, it is important to ensure the tests have sufficient detail. I know I sound like a broken telephone, and I have mentioned this quite a few times, but it's just really appreciating what is important. Now, like for instance, performing a cutoff testing without describing what the actual test is and what documents should be used will not gain any marks. It is important to stress that the source documents is GDNs, goods dispatch notes, before and after the year end, that this need to be agreed to the sales invoice to ensure they have been corrected, they've been included in the correct accounting period. I don't know if you've noticed what we've done here. We've used a verb. So the first thing is substantive procedures. Use a verb. What are you doing? Obtain the GDNs before the year end, after the year end, pre and post. And then from there, what are you doing? You're also obtaining what? Mention the document, the GDNs, when, before and after. Why? Because you want to confirm the correct accounting period. So you also saying here, agree to the sales invoice, agree to the sales ledger, just to ensure that they've been recorded in the correct accounting period. Now that's a very good direction. Now, for instance, we had a question here, describe substantive procedures the auditor should obtain to obtain, to perform to obtain sufficient evidence when it comes to existence and valuation. Now, some of these questions are very specific. They tell you which assertions they want. So if you give assertions that don't tie to existence and valuation, okay? 2, be detailed. In this session, some candidates included things like review after date cash receipts. How? That only gives you half a mark. I know it's a very common answer. You might have seen it in your Capiano BPP books, but I want you guys to really go the extra mile and feel as if you're communicating. How do I review after date cash receipts? What do I do? All right? Maybe you should go on to expand on that and say, follow these receipts through to the pre-year end receivable balance. Review customer correspondence for disputed balances. It's only half a mark. But if you go on to say, as this needs to be discussed with management with regards to whether an allowance may be required may be required, that will gain you 1 mark. So I don't know if you've noticed, you've given, yes, the procedure, the test, but you've also stated why you're doing it. So the reason is so important. In substantive procedures, the verb, the document, or the person you're talking to or inquiring from, and why you're doing it. This is a full substantive procedure. Now, for trade receivables, valid analytical procedures such as comparing the trade receivables to the prior year with significant differences being discussed with management will gain the full 1 mark. Candidates who compare the balance to the prior year to identify any significant differences only gained half a mark, as the process of comparing current to prior only identifies the differences. To gain the other mark, you have to state that you're going to investigate those differences or discuss further with management about those differences so that you can get a better understanding of what could be the problem. Spend some time here. Now, candidates who focused on casting the receivables listing and agreeing to financial statements, reviewing after-date cash receipts, reviewing the age receivables reports for slow-moving balances, discussing with management the need for allowance, reviewing customer correspondence for balances in dispute, undertaking analytical review procedures and specifying which ones were able to gain credit, okay? Were able to gain credit in that question. Now, when you're generating substantive procedures, especially for trade receivables or payables, it's imperative that you focus. You're told here the focus of the test is on the statement of financial position. Why? This is such a big error. Most guys talk about, you have to appreciate that trade payables is in the SOFP. People talk about purchases. If it's the trade receivables, people talk about sales. I appreciate that trade receivables arise as a result of sales on credit, but remember, your focus is on testing on the balance of receivables, not on the sales transaction. Your focus is not on testing the transaction, but the balance of trade receivables. And therefore, we expect to see your procedures circulating around that. Kindly take your time to read the question requirements. I know I sound like a broken telephone, but just take your time. This means that in your section A, try to finish it as fast as possible so that you can get ample time for section B, and try to understand what is expected of you as a result of that. As we come almost to the near end, tests of control, my favorite, but not the favorite for many students, because it's in this part where you find you have, given the deficiency, explanation gives you half a mark, given an appropriate recommendation gives you 1 mark. Now, the first step normally is just read through the scenario. Give yourself a chance to understand the scenario. Read, highlight maybe your deficiencies if that's what you're being asked for, or the controls that you can place reliance on. Highlight them as you read through. Choose, sometimes you'll be told identify 4, you might find more than that. Choose your best. Now, once you identify, it is important to record what the actual deficiency from the scenario is. This is what I told you guys, copy paste with wisdom. Copy paste with wisdom, all right? Now, to gain 1 mark, so when I'm giving explanations normally in controls, I like you to look at how the business is affected. I know most students really struggle with this because I'm like, that will sound like the auditor is a consultant, and we've had so many questions around this. Hopefully I'll touch on that in the Q&A. Now, in the control recommendations, you want to ensure that your recommendations are actions. Okay, first of all, they are detailed, and then there are actions. What should we do? Okay, not objectives. So you have to ensure that if you say here, phrases like ensure that receivables are recorded. How? Ensure that indeed, this employees clock in and out. How? Ensure that there are CCTVs. How? Okay? Tell us what to do. Candidates need to take the time to ensure that recommendations are well described, they address the deficiency identified, and they are practical. They are practical. They are telling us, for instance, let's say there was a theft in payables, and then you say, fire everyone. Hey, it's a recommendation, but it's not a practical one. Now, for the deficiency of no clear definition of responsibilities within the team, the recommendation of responsibilities should be allocated within the team. Will not gain any credit, as they've not said how this responsibility should be allocated. You see, this how question, very important. The recommendation is to state that one team member should count and the other record the quantities. Now that answers the how. Just saying that that the responsibility should be allocated. How should they be allocated? How should they be allocated? Go in depth. Explain it to us. Now, as I wrap up, some of the common mistakes, just some quick tips for me to really touch on before we get into the Q&A. One, do a lot of practice. I know we sound like we're always repeating ourselves, but I did emphasize this at the very beginning. Two, don't read for audit in division. What I mean by this is, let me give an example. Unlike tax, tax, we appreciate income tax and inheritance tax are two different types of taxes. So they may not really complement each other. Even the rates are different. But in audit, when you go to the study hub, one of the things you really appreciate is that from the beginning of the chapter all the way to from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 31 describes the whole audit process. I would love to visualize myself in the audit and say, okay, the very first thing is for me to really understand what is audit all about. And then I go on and I say, what are the due diligence processes I should take when I want to accept a client? Go on, okay, what should I do after that? Maybe risk assessment. All right, maybe assess, which particular areas could ideally ensure we give an inappropriate audit opinion so that we can focus on them. All right, fantastic. Now that we appreciate that audit risk is a component of three aspects, and one of them is controls or control risk, maybe we should see whether we can rely on the controls or not. So test of controls. Then you move on and you're like, okay, fine. Now we've assessed the controls. We've assessed the inherent risk. We now know that the risk of material misstatement is high. So we do need to reduce our detection risk. And that means we need to do multiple substantive procedures. So chapter 15 all the way to 29 takes you through substantive procedures, and you now understand why you're doing them. And then you realize, okay, now the next thing we have is to draft our report. We've collected our audit evidence. We have sufficient appropriate audit evidence to give an opinion. Let's draft our report. And then wait, oops, what happens with going concern? So you realize chapter 1 to 31 is the whole audit process. Visualize it that way. And then 3, this is usually my recommendation to students, do a PEMS checkup. What is a PEMS checkup? A PEMS checkup is, I hope you guys are physically fit for the exam. It seems like a joke, but some people, unfortunately, protect yourself as far as you can so that you can do the exam in good condition. 2, do an emotional check. I joke with my students normally that if you're dating, tell your person, if you're planning to break up with me, I know this is the Valentine's weekend, the Valentine's week, just tell them, listen, don't break up with me just yet. I have an exam to do, okay? Just on a light note. 3, mental. Check your thoughts. Your thoughts will reflect your attitude. Your thoughts will even determine your fear, particularly so. Screen, audit your thoughts. And then 4, spiritual. I know we all come from different spiritual backgrounds, but it is not wrong to pray once in a while. Sit down, the things that are beyond you, and therefore you'd want the Maker to help you. Now, what I want you guys to do is, I'd love you guys to just engage me here. When do you think is the pre-match 2024 mock release date? When do you think? Please click on your answers. I'd really love to see whether you guys are whether you guys know the materials we've prepared for you guys to excel. Just click on that, and then we'll be looking at you can just click on no idea. But what do you think? Just click on it, whatever you think. Click on it. You tell me, when do you think your mock is? Now, your mock is not there to mock you as much as the, the name sounds it. The mock is there to prepare you. The mock is there to really know where you stand. The mock is there to, ideally, it's initially one of the last stages to just ensure we know where you stand. The mock. So when is the mock? When is the pre-match 2024 mock release date? Very keen to know. You could click there, no idea. You could click there 22nd. You could click there. I mean, you have a variety, whatever you choose. When is the mock date? All right. I'd love to hear your contributions on the same. All right. I loved the MOOC. Actually, the MOOC gave me some ease when I was doing the MOOC some years back, though we didn't have the privilege of having the resources you guys have. But I remember we used to have a MOOC in class, and it used to really put me in a place where I knew where I should be. And that gave me so much comfort. I was like, okay, I think I need to work on this. I think I need to work on that. So when do you think it is? Let's just try and see. Let's see what you guys have stated. So 12th of February, well done. I agree with you. I fully agree with you. All right, so it's already out. That means you guys should run and go do the mock. All right, it's already out. Fantastic. What about the debrief? Right, so we normally do a debrief. An expert tutor will take you through, and just tell you, right, you know what, how this should have been done, or how this should have been attended, or how this should have been tackled. When do you think the debrief is going to be released on the, ACCA YouTube pages, or the student resource, specifically YouTube channel? When do you think this is going to happen? Right, let's see whether you guys know your stuff. Let me tell you something as you answer this. For me, why I said audit is an easy paper is because audit, truly, in my opinion, audit might tell you a story about yourself. I've found one of the best students in my classes that do so well have such a great self-awareness of self, because there's an appreciation of who they are, how they work, what best works for them. Also, another tip maybe I should have added is one of the things that I normally used to do when I used to do my exams was that in between breaks, when I would take breaks in my study, I would, instead of using, we didn't have the privilege of being so highly distracted with our gadgets, but I would love to either take a walk or just reflect on what I would do. I'd actually maybe just go out in the balcony or just take a walk and just really reflect on what I've done, and that would give me such a clarity in my mind. So I can only imagine, even for us, what would it normally really show you, or what would you really appreciate in terms of what you would do in that break? I would even do press-ups. Can you imagine? I do like about 50, not 50, man, I'm blowing my trumpet. I do like about 10 or 20 press-ups just to see where I just to refresh my mind, and then I'll go back to reading. So I hope you guys do the same. So let's see what you guys have said. All right, so there's a huge focus on 16th, which is today, which is actually today. You guys are fantastic students. I do agree with you. It is the 16th of February. All right, now it is time for Q&A, and I will pick up a few questions here. So tips on how we should approach the substantive procedure questions when they're about specific procedures. All right, now what I would normally do whenever there are specific assertions, first and foremost, let me start off with appreciating the fact that you have to be very familiar with the area. All right, so which area you really tested on? Is it receivables? Is it inventory? It's very important to also understand the document or the process around that particular area. Now, if it, for instance, tells you, if the question requires you to, let's say, for instance, test on valuation of receivables, one of the tips that I would normally do is I'll try to really understand how can I deal with the irrecoverability? How can I confirm the irrecoverability of receivables? Because the irrecoverability of receivables focuses primarily affects the valuation aspect. So I'd normally think of the documents I'd have to inspect and what should I match them against. So sometimes probably you'd have to match those documents you're inspecting against another document of prime entry or another source document, or primarily the trial balance. So I'd be very careful to ensure that, I'd be very keen to really understand what particular books of accounts or what particular document should I inspect per se in such a space. And then here I filed AA twice, 44 and 43. Any types, please. First and foremost, my apologies for that. I really, really hope that it doesn't push you down. First and foremost, I want to congratulate you for going that far and just attempting it twice. And that means the fact that you're here means that you're willing to do it again. So I'd really want to give you a thumbs up for that. Now, for me, whenever you're feeling between 44 and 43, one of the issues there is your exam technique. First and foremost, use the My Exam Performance tool. It's a fantastic tool to really just tell you your weak areas. I've had a student, I remember one student who actually came to speak in my class on Monday, failed on Wednesday actually, sorry, had failed audit the first time and they failed with I think 48, which is very painful. And sometimes you'd wonder, why didn't they just give me that 2 marks, you know? And one of the few things that I really appreciated with him was that we sat down with him, we looked at his My Examens performance just to see his weak areas, and we could work on that. And I realized that the only thing he needed was exam practice, all right? And that really helped him, and he got 70. Can you imagine? So for that My Exam Practice platform, fantastic. You usually find it on My SEC. It can really tell you where you need to work on. And then here, let me just... So you say, can we write short forms of IAS standards like PPE in the exam? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. How can you make the answers more specific to gain more marks than generic ones? Fantastic. This is a very good question because many times I know we have Rotland answers, right? So there's an appreciation of the fact that you really want to pick up maybe the documents that are mentioned within the scenario, the people that are mentioned. So if I see they've mentioned the financial controller, instead of saying discuss only with management, I might say discuss with the financial controller. If I find that they've mentioned the payables ledger, I would probably want to inspect my purchases, the invoices, and attach them to or agree them to the purchases, the payables ledger. I might find that there are certain things that they might have mentioned within the scenario that can give me an appreciation of what to actually tailor my answer to specifically. So I usually use the wordings within the scenario. I usually highlight the people mentioned, the documents mentioned, and that really just gives me a chance to know how to link my answer. All right. March 2024 exam is my 5th attempt. My goodness, twice I got 49. Oh my. I really want to pass this. Man, you're so close, and I'm so glad that you're able to push this far. So what I would normally say is that just in the same advice that I gave one of us who had failed, use the My Exam Performance tool. It can really help to know where you've worked. 2, probably your issue is very minimal. You might find that maybe there are some areas that you might just need to tailor your answer specifically to the scenario. Or at the same time, you might have found that maybe also sometimes for me, I have failed before. So I finished SCCA in 2 years, but I failed. I won't lie to you. And I don't talk too much about how I did that. But the thing is that I remember for me, I had to first of all deal with the cloudiness of failure. Failure makes you think that you can't do it again. You have to first of all deal with your emotions first before such you can get a clear mind. So what I did that worked for me was I would sometimes, I failed twice, or rather I failed once, but I failed 2 papers in 1 attempt. And one of the few things that I did was to actually refocus my attention on really trying to understand where I might have gone wrong, and then how I could work better on that. So if you find that you have a weak area that you really, really need to work on, sometimes you might find that you're only giving answers that are very repeated, as opposed to really understanding also your nature of your answers. You're really taking the time to, when you're reading the mark, like for instance, if it's substantive procedure, try to read what you've written and try to see whether that process makes sense. Take a register, take a paper. I used to have multiple books in my room where I'd always assume those are that's my payables books, that's my receivables book, that's my, I used to name physical books as my actual, because that's why we got, our books of accounts were actual books. So I used to now ask myself, if I tell myself, agree this to this, does that really make sense? So I'll read what I've written and then I'll actually practically do it with the books in my room, just normal exercise books. And I'll actually see whether that actually helps or not. And then please advise which are the most common tested areas in part A and any tips and tricks you'd like to share with us. That's Roadland, and I'll be honest, but because you said commonly tested, it's a very dangerous space because part A can really test on anything, and therefore we don't really want to specify which particular area. The reason why it's multiple choice is because we want to try and test literally everything. We want to ensure the students are reading everything. and not necessarily trying to guess what might show up. So that might be a bit of an issue sometimes to just try and determine. Of course, we could say corporate governance could be there, ethics could be tested there, and maybe a substantive procedure question or a report question. But you see, I'll end up mentioning every part of the syllabus. So any part can be tested. So one of you says, what if someone hasn't completed studying the textbook and he or she just focus on practicing questions due to time constraints, especially when it is close to the exam day? I would say yes. My issue would be whether you understand the nature of the questions and how you're practicing them and the nature of the answers. Knowledge is a significant part of your understanding. So sometimes the questions might help you to refer back to specific parts of your knowledge aspect. So it can still work, okay? It can still work. Questions are very important in this last stage. How can you link to the scenario effectively? Okay, I think I've answered that. Okay, it isn't always clear whether the questions is knowledge-based or linked to the scenario. Is there any standard wording or any other indicator used within the questions which will help students quickly identify in the exam whether the question is knowledge-based or scenario-based, where it may be ambiguous? Very good. So many times, to be on the safe side, when you read a knowledge-based question, I would quickly just peruse through the scenario just to see if there's any link, especially if it's not mentioned, to be on the safer side, all right? To be on the safer side. Remember, we're trying to also adopt professional skepticism. So you really just want to ask yourself, really, okay, fine, maybe they've not said anything per se, but is there any particular, tie toward the scenario? But many times, of course, knowledge-based questions could particularly not really be tied to the scenario, but if it is not, sometimes they might mention it and say that this has no tie towards the scenario, okay? The examiner made sure that in the examiner's report that they would mention that. Then in risk questions, a paragraph has usually 2 to 3 risks. Do we have to mention all 2 to 3 risks at the same time? Or else we can mention risk from a paragraph and move on to the next paragraph. All right, so this is the part of where you identify. So most people copy paste everything, and therefore you find yourself copy pasting about 2 to 3 risks in one part, okay? Learn how to subdivide them so that you don't miss out on critical marks. You might find that those 2 to 3 risks are 2 to 3 answers, right? So split them. Now, if they say the finance director does not create allowance, if they say the finance director does not create allowances, what will be the audit response? All right, I need you to be a bit more specific on what allowance that could be. Is it for receivables? Is it what particularly could be the issue there? Because the thing is that you want to appreciate the fact that this could be in accordance to IAS 37 provisions, contingent liability, contingent assets. And therefore, it gives you the appreciation of the fact that you want to first and foremost determine, based on the scenario, if there's a probable case for the same. And as a result of that, assess how much that might necessarily be. All right. So, the fact that they've not created one, most people think that because in the scenario, this person has done the wrong thing, clearly, that's not a risk. Because most of us think there's a risk, it might happen. But you have to understand audit risk is the risk that the auditor might express an inappropriate audit opinion, not the risk that the accountant might have done the wrong thing. They might have done the wrong thing. And it might even be stated that, for instance, training has been capitalized as part of an asset. And you have to know that training expenses should not. But the thing is that our fear is that the auditor could express an inappropriate audit opinion or state that the financial statements are true and fair while they're not. Okay. And then let's see. Okay, please advise the best way to approach the exam, from which part to start and how to divide the time. All right. For every question, this is a very good part. For every question, for every mark, we normally allocate 1.5 minutes. 1.5 minutes, okay? So 1.8 minutes, sorry. So if it's a 10-mark question, like in section A, that's 18 minutes. So if there are 3 questions, usually, that are each of 10 marks, that's 54 minutes. And you then appreciate the fact that you can be able to practice based on that. So note this, for every 1 mark, 1.8 minutes. That can really help you. 2, I have a bias. I have a bias to quickly finish with, the multiple choice section A, flag the ones that you have issues with. Don't waste too much time on them. If you don't really understand them, just flag the question. You'll come back to it and move to section B. But cover section A first. That's my bias. Because I grew up in a system where we had order, finish chapter question 1 first, then question 2, then question 3. And if I don't finish it, I can come back to it and flag it so that I don't waste time. So that's what I would normally do, and I'd always finish the exam on time in some cases. In the substantive procedure, do we have to include the scenario in our answer for every point? Maybe not every point, because you'll find probably like with analytical procedures, you might not necessarily have a specific, mention of an analytical procedure or a ratio within the scenario. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to mention it for every point, but at least ensure it is relevant to the scenario. Okay, relevant to the scenario doesn't mean it has to be included, but it can help you to confirm certain things within the scenario. Do we have to mention ISA standards compulsorily? No, don't even dare. Don't guess. It's like, for instance, even with standards, like even with IFRSs, we don't say, like if I tell you ISA 315 risk assessment, identifying risk assessment, you might not really remember that. So I don't expect you to do so. Okay, I don't expect you to do so. Don't. Can you use terms like SOFP, PNL interchangeably? Don't use them interchangeably. Use, if it's statement, if it's SOFP, it's SOFP. The reason why I prefer you guys doing that is because in accordance to IS1, we stopped calling balance sheets. Okay, now they're SOFP. So I prefer you saying, SPL, SOFP, all right? Any tips on how you should approach the substantive? Okay, I think I've answered that. I think I've also answered quite a few. I have problems, all right? Let me just see the last ones as we wrap up. Is writing heading in risk and internal control Is writing the heading in risk and internal control compulsory? Trying to understand in terms of whether it is compulsory. It's not. I don't know. I would need some clarification on what you mean there. Okay, I have questions that whether I could get full marks or recommendations for the deficiency of internal control if I write the phrase to ensure that, to explain the objective after I write my objective. Thanks a lot. Okay, yes. Yes, you can. The beauty with writing to ensure that at the end is because you're explaining why you did what you're doing. So what you're basically doing here is that you're saying, we've installed, you should install a CCTV camera so that, or to ensure that. So you see, to ensure that after you've given the action, explains the reason why you're doing it, and that's fine. That's fantastic, actually. Problems in identifying audit risk. Any tips? Yes. When I'm looking at the question, always think of which part. If you identify something that you think could be a risk, ask yourself how it could affect the financial statements. If you can't have an answer to that, then it might not be a risk. It might be a business risk. Okay. Where can we find your study resources? Oh, God. Wow, that's a very good question. And right now, of course, the people who privileged mostly from me are the students that I teach. I teach at a university called Strathmore University in Kenya. So they're the ones who benefit mostly from the resources I give. Okay, but of course, there are also resources that are done with ACCA that we normally post publicly in their student support resources, and therefore you can find a few videos of mine there. All right. Yes, because I see the one who is asking is actually from my country. All right. The last question as we end. Should understanding of the ISA requirements be more important? It's not easy to remember the ISA numbers. That's right. No, don't remember the ISA numbers. Remember what they say. Okay, so I might not tell you, remember IS2, true, inventory, but you may remember that inventory should be valued at the law of cost and net realizable value. All right? Yes. Now, let me end there. Thank you so much for your fantastic questions. I've really enjoyed. I really, really do hope that this was very useful to you. I would really love to hear from you if these debriefs are really helpful. It would be a joy for us to just know that we are continuously supporting our students in any way that we can. Also, I would recommend that and appreciate the fact that this recording will be sent to your email so you can access them after this, all right? So, and please do the MOOCs. Please do the MOOCs. Test yourself on the same. And I would say also breathe. Also breathe, okay? Get some rest before the exam date, and get a chance to rest before, so that you can go to the exam room with a clear mind, all right? I don't think there's anything left there, but I would want to say thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your engagement. I really, really appreciate it, and the questions that you've asked. My apologies if you've not touched all the questions, but I do hope that we've adequately been able to touch on every other thing that you might have an issue with. All right, please click on the YouTube channel, this ICCA Student Support Resources, subscribe to it. There's very good content there from expert tutors, which can also help you to understand different parts. All right, thank you very much.